The order in which a narrative is presented can change a lot about how you engage with that piece of media. However, alterations in linearity are not always for reasons necessarily beneficial to the plot. For instance, the many narratives that open in media res do not always necessarily do so because the creators believe that it served the plot in some specific way, but rather that putting you partway through the narrative to where things get interesting will pique your interest and get you to want to engage with this narrative. It's almost like marketing that is injected directly into a narrative. It's saying, no, I promise I am interesting, just keep engaging, and I promise you'll see, I promise, senpai. There's an almost unconfident perspective to this way of writing, and that can be a bit disappointing. However, alterations in the linearity of a narrative, especially when they come to be fundamental to the narrative as a whole, are when non-linearity can truly shine. If the only thing a narrative does in terms of non-linearity is show you that the main character gets into some tough situations or something like that, then it's a bit disappointing in its lack of confidence. But sometimes something like Beacon Pines comes along that is very interesting in its deployment of non-linear storytelling. Now, games are often kind of bad at non-linearity in terms of narrative time. Sure, loads of games market themselves as non-linear experiences, but what they mean by that is that there is not a set order in which you have to do things, or there's an open world. But non-linearity in terms of narrative time is a bit different. Going backwards and forwards in time can render a game harder to follow, or if your character has certain upgrades and abilities, then altering the timeline can mean needing to change what your character is able to do at different points in their life, and that can be annoying from a gameplay perspective. This is why many games which incorporate non-linear storytelling techniques such as flashbacks will often confine them to cutscenes. You don't play these past events, you just see them. Some games dabble in non-linear narrative presentation like Singularity or Bioshock Infinite, but they're little more than a narrative contrivance a lot of the time. Whereas Beacon Pines is interesting because the game at first glance appears to be non-linear in how it is told, but not really. Essentially, the way this works is by having multiple timelines in which different events could occur. You experience one timeline which leads to a dead end of some kind, and so you take a different timeline, and then because of information or an item that you found in one of these other timelines, you can go back to the dead end timeline and solve the problem that was stopping you from progressing. Essentially, you are time traveling between different narrative choices and making different decisions that alter the flow of events so that you can proceed down different possibilities in the timeline. The ultimate goal is obviously to eventually reach the timeline that will have the actual narrative conclusion. However, the thing that is so interesting about the way that Beacon Pines does this is that the non-chronological arrangement of the game is kind of a lie. Sure, it appears to be non-linear in its narrative presentation, but you are always ultimately going toward a correct timeline. It feels like it is non-linear until you reach the end of the game, at which point it feels chronological. This is quite a masterful sleight of hand for the game to present to us. This game, before I go on, is definitely worth checking out for reasons beyond the narrative presentation. It is a fantastic game with an adorable art style. It is delightful. But it's also a great way to discuss the use of narrative time. Now, there is a difference between narrative time and gameplay time. The narrative time is the actual presentation of events in the narrative, and they can deviate from one another. But then the gameplay time is the time and order of play. And Beacon Pines doesn't really allow for much variation in how you approach its non-linear story. The story will always pretty much play out in the same way. A game in which you could alter the flow of time in many ways and achieve entirely different results would be a game that features true non-linear narrative presentation in terms of the depiction of time. Beacon Pines does a great job pretending to be non-linear while actually being very linear. It's something very interesting that only truly applies to gaming. Gerard Genet, a narratologist, wrote an important series of texts about narratives, and his most notable development of narrative understanding was in narrative time. His ideas were aimed toward prose, and they don't entirely apply to games. There are certain issues that make it just a bit different when it comes to games over books. Games can alter and manipulate time based on gameplay elements that do not necessarily change time in the way that Genet discussed when talking about books. When you study narratology, you are always taught about Genet's narrative time concepts. It is foundational to the field, but seeing variations in it in narrative mediums other than novels presents us with the reality of art as a whole. You cannot treat every art form the same way. The way you analyze the narrative in a book is very different to the way that you would do it in a game. A book, no matter how many times you read it, will always be read in the same order. It, even when narratively non-linear in terms of the use of time, will always have an unchanging reading time. The same is not true of games. The gameplay time and the narrative time can differ from one another in ways that differentiate it from more static art form. And so, ultimately, my whole point for this little discussion is to say that you cannot apply what works for certain mediums directly onto others. Do not look at games and expect them to be able to mimic the trappings of movies, because they will never truly succeed. And you cannot expect movies to do what games do without failing. Every different medium has its strengths and its weaknesses. They are all unique to themselves, and you need to treat them that way, especially when it comes to adaptations. There's a reason that many movies based on games are not good, and that's because a film can never fundamentally capture what a game is or does. And on the other side, a game can never truly capture what a movie does. Treat different mediums in different ways, and you will see the myriad of ways that they are unique and unadaptable.